When you do maximum tolerated dose, you do everything you can to wipe out every one of those cells.
Yeah.
That's then what makes the more aggressive moths that we just talked about.
Right.
But what happens is if you just come in and you put a little bit into the equation, you might pull back, let's say 50% of those cancer cells. You like kind of build a little bit of a runway, and then you back off and you let the body do its thing. And you only intervene with another little sort of sprinkling of the poison just when it gets to a certain volume, certain level. And then you do the same thing, and it buys you more time. And you're then start to switch this into a battle zone, into a maintained zone. Like, here's now something that people can live long, healthy lives with cancer and not die of it. And here, coming all the way back, when you over harvest those daughter cells, when you over treat, overkill with maximum tolerated dose, you inherently wake up what they call the mother cells, which are the stem cells. And she's pissed.
As I say, if
Yeah.
you piss off mama, guess what? Everybody's going to suffer.
And this is what happens.
Welcome to the Practicing with Dr. Nathan Goodyear podcast. I'm the medical director at brio-medical in Scottsdale, Arizona. I am both a conventionally trained and licensed medical doctor, as well as a licensed medical homeopathic doctor. This podcast is your resource for a scientific-based discussion of all things cancer and beyond from a natural, holistic, and integrative perspective. It's time to teach the body how to heal. So here we go.
We're going to take a deep dive into cancer as a metabolic disease. We are here again with, I would say, the great Dr. Nasha Winters. Now, that is because you're doing great things, right? Greatness doesn't come from a title. It doesn't come from a name. It comes from things that people do. And, we talked about it. You need to check out the other podcasts because we have been the guests of most gracious hosts, Nasha Winters and her husband, Stephen. And he is a fabulous chef. And we talk through your history. And I've mentioned this in those two podcasts, your history and then your book, how you haven't just experienced things, you've learned things, but then you've acted upon them. And when you look throughout history, Nasha, history defines great people by doing great things. It's action. And that's why I can say you're the great Nasha Winters, because you've done great things out of your experience, which check out that podcast because it's going to tug on your heartstrings. And with the book, but then now what you're doing with the organization, and we'll touch on that at the very end, because now you're changing the trajectory, the course of oncology. And that's no easy task. That's no easy task, because needless to say, there's inherent calcentrism. People are they're immobile. I'm trying to come up with a word there, and I can't do that. But they're immobile. They're fixed. They're not going to change. And you're forcing change, but you're doing the right way. You're asking questions. You're building bridges, and I think that's very important. We talked about that over dinner multiple nights. How you recognize opportunities, and you build bridges, and you don't know where that bridge will go, but it's a bridge that you can come back to maybe days later or years later or decades later. So I wanted to talk on this concept of cancer as a metabolic disease, but I want to start with the concept of the way cancer is perceived today is, unfortunately, I think, still the same way we think about so many things related to cancer, and it goes all the way back to the 19th century. Paul Ehrlich, an immunobiologist, he came up with the concept of one chemical for one disease. Actually, chemotherapy had no context with cancer. It was using one chemical for one disease. He actually used salvarsan, which is it's a drug, and he was using it for the treatment of neurosyphilis. So it's salvarsan. And he used that to treat that. So that's where the idea came, one chemical, one disease. Now, he then coined the term silver bullet. That became the magic bullet theory. And I see that concept permeate medicine, but particularly oncology today.
Yeah.
So cancer is a genetic disease, right? I'm being sarcastic. I'm being sarcastic because that falls into the one-hit hypothesis.
Yeah.
Really, cancer is a heterogeneous disease.
Exactly.
And I think that ties in beautifully with the concept that is metabolism as the flies join us today. Because we'll talk about the tumor microbiome and the gut microbiome, so the flies are already collecting. But tell me, because cancer is a metabolic disease, that was the context of your book.
Yeah.
Elaborate on that a little bit, how that separates from the one-hit hypothesis, the magic bullet theory, the silver bullet theory, and that how that still combats with the current conventional wisdom today.
Yeah. So a couple things you said, just like my wheels are turning here, but one of the things I thought was so interesting is you bring up this concept of heterogeneity. So, which just means a whole lot of stuff happening.
Oh yeah.
You know, and a lot of different stuff happening.
Right.
And maybe even completely opposite stuff happening in the same environment. Like this turns it on, this turns it off in the same space. So it's tough when people are like, well, if you just are looking for the one-to-one, you're going to miss the one-to-many possibility. So there's that. You alluded to, hey, isn't cancer just a genetic disease, which is what we are still approaching it as for, you know, this experiment of 110 years or so. And we have, unfortunately, it hasn't been as successful as we'd hope. Not to say genes don't play a role, but they're not the starting point. They're a downstream expression. So the upstream is what's happening in the terrain, the mitochondria, the metabolic expression of our cells. So in this really interesting level, and we kind of touched on some of those concepts too. But here's what I think is so interesting. We still have a dominant medical model that's doing the one-to-one, one treatment, one target, one drug. And yet even the American Cancer Society says that cancer is a collection of hundreds of diseases. So how can you both say it's a bunch of things and then just say, and there's one way or a very small handful of ways to approach it?
Right.
That's really confusing to me. So there's number one. The other thing, I'm sure you've talked about this or covered this with people you've interviewed, but I'm so compelled by the idea of the cell nuclear transfer studies. And so have you guys covered that much? I can
Not
go
really.
super
No,
simple.
we have not.
Because this is what really sets the foundation for the metabolic. So
that connects the terrain with the genetic material. And
totally.
Yeah.
And so if cancer was truly a genetic disease, you would take the hard drive, which is the nuclei, out of the cell, and you would take that out of that cell and replace it. So let's say we have a healthy cell with a healthy nuclei, then you remove that nuclei and you replace the nuclei of a cancer cell. If this was a genetic disease, that cell should now express in a normal, healthy way. The opposite is true, that if you took a cancer cell's nuclei, hard drive out, and you replace the hard drive in a healthy cell, if this was a genetic disease, you should make that turn into a cancer cell. This has been repeated many, many times, and yet never does it change the expression of creation of or diminishing of cancer.
So let me present this context because this is a very important study, and I want to tie in something I mentioned to you earlier over coffee. Have a guest here. Won't leave me alone.
We like you today.
Is that if you have the environment of a cell, so you got the border of the cell, you got all the contents, the cytoplasm, everything in there, and right inside, within this whole context, is the nucleus where the genetic material is. Okay, and what she's saying is, if you take the nucleus out of the cancer cell and put it into the environment, the cell of a healthy cell, it does not change that. In fact, it's the healthy environment that changes the genetic material.
Yeah, it's like the swimming pool is what matters more than what's floating in it.
Exactly. Yeah, now that's a scary thought. Having 4 kids.
Oh, God.
Anyway.
Right. The Babe Ruth from my childhood.
That's right.
Yeah.
Say, honey, have the kids been in the pool?
Yeah.
Because there's something floating by.
Something not good.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, because that brings me to a
Uh,
very beautiful point. Let me find
mm,
that. I mentioned it to you this morning. So many cancers are driven by obesity.
mm,
I know there are people that advocate. I actually saw a doctor on social media saying that as a physician, if you are telling patients that they need to lose weight to be healthy, you are hurting them.
yeah, you're shaming them.
Now,
Yeah,
I think there's ways that you could do
yeah,
that are not helpful and
yeah.
constructive. But this physician was saying that obesity is healthy.
Mm,
Now we know that pancreatic cancer, colorectal cancer, many of these cancers uh, are they're obesity driven
right,
cancer. So
right.
we know that that's not really a question for debate.
Mm,
Here it is right here. So talking about this environment, beautiful point, Nasha. But this was a 2023 article from Nature Metabolism, but it's entitled "Adipocytes Reprogram Cancer Cell Metabolism by Diverting Glucose Towards Glycerol 3-Phosphate, thereby promoting metastasis."
mhm,
It ties in exactly what you're saying. Here, it's the fat cells
right.
that are not contributing to the carcinogenic process, but they're altering the metabolism
Yeah,
that leads to the metastatic spread of the cancer.
yeah. Fascinating, right?
Yeah, so that right there, this is the metabolomic proof of what you're talking
Right,
about.
right.
Now, that research, that's not new research, right?
No, this is what's so amazing is the first time this was sort of like, oh, that's interesting, was when this very somewhat controversial uh, clinician, doctor and researcher from the 1920s was showing that the mitochondria, which are also organelles inside the cell, um, looked different in between cancer cells and non-cancer cells.
Mhm.
They kind of looked like little raisins compared to plump, you know, plump grapes. And he was just noticing that and wondering, like he sort of had some ideas, he had some questions, he had some assumptions, and those, when he started to approach it, he got some surprising results, which was at that time. Now, this is before any of the conversations around ketogenic diet or anything. We didn't know that. Like, there was nothing. He's not the person who made ketosis, part of the discussion. He's the person who showed us the underlying issue that led to, many years later, hey, this is maybe what ketosis impacts, is what we were seeing with this Dr. Otto Warburg
Yeah.
back at that time. And so he was noticing different amounts, like the physical anatomical structure of the mitochondria being different, but then also the energy output being different, and the what that sick little raisin mitochondria was doing was sucking up more resources differently than the healthy mitochondria.
Right.
And so that is what has sort of set this pace of people scratching their head and asking questions, or even, because he was controversial, unfortunately, at a time. I really recommend people read the book Ravenous, which is Apple. I can't remember his first name, but Apple is the author's last name. And that is something that Sam Apple was the name of the book, Ravenous. He talked about the controversy of it, which shut down this research in one
Wow.
way. So it was like, okay, because he was he was Jewish in Germany at the time of World War II. He was also gay. And so he was like a whole pile of paradoxes and controversies. But his religious colleagues, his Jewish friends, felt betrayed when he stayed back and basically worked for Hitler
Oh,
as a researcher, because the other thing about the Nazis is they were very interested in cancer research. And
I did not
so
know that.
very much Hitler had a very paranoia around
Now I know
cancer.
he's paranoid.
Yeah, extremely. But cancer was the thing he was most afraid of.
No, I did not know this.
So this book is fascinating. So he basically, because Otto Warburg was very much like, I'm going to find the cure to cancer, so he didn't care what was going on around him. He
Right.
was not like, he didn't give one rat's about the politics, the all the things, right? So, but he upset a lot of people. So he was already controversial from that. Then, even though he was brilliant and everyone recognized him, and he won Nobel Prizes in the 1930s for his work, we were really moving forward in his understanding, and we would have probably gotten there much faster if he wasn't so controversial. But also, good old Watson and Crick came along in the
Yeah.
50s,
Yeah.
found the DNA helix,
Everything became a
and
genetic.
everything, like took on
Everything.
Bovary's work from 1914 and said, okay, forget about the metabolomics, or which we weren't calling then, forget about the terrain, forget about the mitochondria, forget about this metabolic process, and let's go back to the gene.
Yeah.
And then we put all of our energy there. And then we decided to do the mapping of the genome, thinking that would be our answer for the one target, one treatment. That failed us miserably. And on and on. And we just keep going back, trying to make the gene theory fit.
Yeah.
And it just simply doesn't.
We are continually trying to put the square peg in a round hole, but we're repackaging it, we're renaming it.
Yeah.
And here is, so
rebranding it.
It's like, come on, guys, it doesn't work. Yeah. And you really are starting to see maybe a pivot in that, because now the way cancer has been framed, obviously it's a genetic disease process. And I think you're exactly right, Watson and Crick. I actually wrote one of my papers. I have a minor in critical writing, but it was on their discovery. Beautiful story, beautiful story. But
although a woman is actually who discovered it, and they took all the credit.
Well,
just saying.
That's true. That's true. But it was from their I think it was from their autobiography.
Yeah.
So that's what I was writing
Very
from.
cool, yeah.
So, and they weren't going to mention that.
Yeah.
So,
nope.
But you're correct. Is now we not a genetic disease, but cancer is always seen as this kind of solid tumor of cells that's isolated from the body, right? But now we're starting to view it differently and go, wow, there are cells that are definitely more tumor in nature, but they're interacting with healthy cells. Yeah. There is this tumor microenvironment. Yeah. So I look at this context of a positive nature, because it's starting to help us to see and hopefully break from this model of thinking, and it fits into this heterogeneous metabolomic process, terrain, environment, than just a solid ball of cells isolated.
Right.
And so I think this is a breaking point. What do you think?
I think so. And I think that, people like Nina Bissell and her work in extracellular matrix in the 80s and beyond, I think, basically Seyfried's work at Boston College coming through in the, like the 2000s and into the early, like 2011, before his book, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease, came out. Excuse me. They're dusting off and resurrecting concepts from the early 1900s that were buried because of controversial individuals, a change in sort of the direction, the advent of the pharmaceutical industry, all these things post World War II, where we've got all this leftover ammo, which it's a good idea. Let's turn it into our agriculture and our pharmaceutical world. And that's where we've put all of our eggs in that basket, and things really haven't been the same since.
We just reimagined war.
We did. And so it's funny, all of our food industry and our health industry are now literally, no wonder we call it the war on cancer, the battle on cancer, because they grew out of that.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting that the energetics, I mean, that sounds a little esoteric, but it's like, wow, it birthed from this wartime.
Yeah.
And so it's easy to keep that going. But folks like these guys have dusted off these concepts and said, what was Dr. Otto Warburg looking at? What was he understanding? So they're not saying he was right, but he handed off a baton that said, look further, keep digging. And of course, you and I were talking about that this morning as well. All of us have to be willing to do that, of like, okay, we don't know what we don't know until we know, and then we pivot. Yeah. But we build upon. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when you learn something new. You're like, well, what about that do we keep in the basket while we keep pushing it down the aisle? And then what is added to that?
It's, this just popped in my head. Yeah. It's a continual ability, or I think intentionality, to try and think bigger, to try and question everything that you do. But it's a daily commitment. Yeah. There was an article, and I've talked about this in other pods before, there was an article, they were talking about how couples that have been together a long time develop kind of a left brain, right brain. So they become like one brain. They compensate for each other's deficiencies. But what the author didn't recognize is that they ended up focusing on that daily commitment, because they interviewed a couple couples, but one of them in particular, that had been married for 65 years. And they asked him, how did you achieve this? And they interviewed them separately and then brought them back together and interviewed them. And they didn't tell them what each other interviewed.
Oh, I love it.
And what they essentially said in their own ways, and then when they brought them back together, they were like, yeah, that's right, is that every day was a commitment to that purpose. And so with what you do, with what I do, because it's very easy for medicine and physicians, because we do struggle with ego and pride. There is this thing called God's complex, where we start to go, well, this is what defines me. This is what I do. This is what I think. And we will start to stagnate, create stagnation within innovation, within thinking. And so it was a daily commitment. So I think we have to have a daily commitment to understanding that tomorrow we may know something different about what we think we know today.
Yeah.
And then in
be
65
okay
years,
with that.
and that's okay. That's science.
Yeah.
That's science. It's not saying I was wrong yesterday.
Right.
We didn't have the information today we had yesterday.
Exactly.
That's okay.
Yeah. And so it's funny because even in the Otto Warburg argument today, people all, like when I hear people say, well, it's not a metabolic, they go back and say, see, Otto Warburg wasn't right. There was some fatal flaws in his thinking. I'm like, no one's saying that what he was saying back in 1920 is what it is. People are saying what he revealed in 1920 is what brought us more curiosity, more research, and the things we're learning, such as the paradox of Warburg, and some of these other things that have led us understanding that it's not just glucose. That, oh, wait a minute, it could be things like arginine, methionine. It could be things like glutamine. That when that cancer gets creative, when it gets adaptable, right? When it gets more adaptable and the healthy cells get less adaptable, it's going to be resourceful. It's going to be like my dogs that are little rescues from the reservations of Gallup, New Mexico. And these guys are so resourceful. They eat better than probably 90% of humans on this planet. And yet they will still find the weirdest things to eat and take in. And it hurts them.
Yeah.
Like they get sick and then they hurt us because we have to clean up after it and all the things. And so this is like cancer, right? It's like you have all the resources you need, but you are still going after everything. One of my colleagues I love, Tina Kazor, she's a naturopathic FABNO. She's a fellowship of the American Board of Naturopathic Oncology. I heard her speak once and she talked about cancer is a sociopath. And I was so intrigued by that because she said it will keep resourcing, taking all of it until it inevitably kills itself.
Yeah.
And so sociopaths do not have the ability to have compassion and are basically separate from their tribe, from their community. And so when she sat there explaining that, I was like, well, that's interesting. That's a good way to describe them. But isn't there sort of I don't know, not cure, but a way to, it's like, how do you bring them back into the fold? How do you reestablish connection and communication? How do you help it understand that it has the tools and resources it needs and it doesn't have to go beyond its boundaries?
So it's I think a good tie here. Let me give this quote, and I mentioned it to Steve yesterday. It's Gang Yu is the author of the quote. Complexity is the prodigy of the world. Simplicity is the sensation of the universe. Behind complexity, there is always simplicity to be revealed.
Wow.
Inside simplicity, there is always complexity to be discovered.
Oof,
so I think it's really showing that what we have to be very careful about today is trying to simplify something that is insanely complex. And in doing that, we misrepresent or oversimplify the facts. So when you look at conventional medicine, we talked about the one-hit hypothesis, the magic bullet theory, the silver bullet. I see a lot of the natural, holistic, and integrative medicine falling prey to that issue. But instead of a drug, instead of it being gene, we'll do something that's more quote unquote alternative, natural. But we're falling prey to the same paradigm of thought.
100%. It's still an anti-something or a simplistic concept here. And and you're correct. It's there are breakdowns on both sides of the equation from pure standard of care and pure alternative care.
Absolutely.
And that if you are someone, so I'll see this on a social media post or something, and someone's like, well, I did IVC and it didn't work, or I ate the ketogenic diet and I still got cancer, or it still progressed, or I was whatever. I'm like, well, the fact that you are still looking at a single target with a single treatment and expecting a different outcome. That philosophy is so inherently flawed, because when you now understand this is hundreds of diseases, this is adapting and changing and resourcing dependent on the information coming in. So if you put in only oxidative therapies, which is standard of care,
Right.
but also
A
an alternative,
lot of alternative is the same way.
IVC
That's
also,
right.
you push that, you're going to push that so hard, it will find a workaround.
Yeah.
Okay. Or you'll just push them all the way off the cliff because it's so devastating to the system. Just like if someone says, well, I've got diagnosed, I'm not going to do any standard care, I'm just going to juice my way out of this.
Right.
That is like just as nuts as the other way. And I'm like, oh my goodness, you guys, you have to look at what you have in this moment. What are the key drivers in this moment? How do we apply the right amount of pressure, the right dose, combination, duration? How do we follow? What metrics do we follow to see if we're moving the dial at all? And then how do we pivot or adjust if things aren't moving in the way we want? Because cancer is trying to survive. So cancer is a survival mechanism. It's a evolutionary survival mechanism,
yes.
right? And it's trying to live and thinking it's helping you try to live.
And tell me if you think this is accurate, or add your piece to it, is that when I'm trying to explain to people what cancer, why did it develop? It's like, you have to understand that cells want to survive. And of course, we want them to survive if they're healthy cells to us.
Yeah.
And if created an environment, they adapt to survive.
Yeah.
In the short term, that is a wonderful thing.
Yep.
But if the inadaptable, unhealthy environment continues, that beneficial adaptation in the short term and the long term becomes something we call cancer.
Exactly. Because
So
then
it's
like,
something
I'm
that's
gonna
good becomes
survive
bad.
broken in
Yeah.
a really broken way, which will perpetuate more signaling to make for more broken cells, which will perpetuate more signaling to make for more broken cells. It's an amplification of a disorganization, discordance, lack of coherence, all these things that lead to, it might start in one place, but if you are nourishing and nurturing around that, it stays put.
Yeah.
But if you are still contributing information, whether that's food, diet, lifestyle, loss of circadian rhythm, certain pharmaceuticals, certain toxic exposures, certain toxic relationships that keep coming in, it is creating vulnerability in the swimming pool of which that cell is swimming in, that then allows that to bring friends, expand, leave that swimming pool and go to another one, and move about the building in a way that this is where I don't understand that we think we can poison ourselves back to health.
The pathway to healing is through destruction. Does that make any sense in nature?
No. Well, maybe in an old Hindu philosophy of Kali, which is the idea of this like total breakdown of everything, but it's people misunderstand it. It's about compost. It's about the soil. It's like, what do you compost out of the dead, out of the death, out of the broken, to become compost to bring something to life?
But there's a point of no return, right?
There is.
So, and when you look at, full dose chemo, we talk about that versus low dose chemo. There's questions about, if you look at some of the immune destruction, just the suppression with the immune system, it's from that therapy. Does it ever come back? And so, I mean, when you look at the CD4 T cells, there's question about whether those even come back. And research shows that some of those CD8 cells, 6 months, 12 months, they're still trying to recover. So in that
T cell exhaustion is a dangerous place to be.
Right. But if you take a low dose, no insulin, but if you take a low dose and then you give it a little bit more frequently in the confines, that's not a therapy you continue indefinitely, right? It actually becomes immunomodulatory and it stimulates the immune system. Totally. Yeah. So I think it's the fine line about, okay, this now is destructive of which there's no point of return. But if we use it within this confine, it's like Thomas Seyfried talked about the press pulse theory.
Totally.
Yeah.
I love it.
There is a time and a place for
Absolutely.
everything.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to look at the data,
Right.
the labs, the patient, and recognize when is the time and when is the place.
Right.
Because you can take 100 patients with breast cancer and try to push them all the same way, and it ain't going to work.
Nada.
Because it's a
Yeah.
heterogeneous process.
And so in Dr. Gatenby, Robert Gatenby's work from Moffitt University, he, in his own, just like, this is what I love about science. Here's a man who was like reading an article or heard an interview with a farmer talking about this moth infestation that happened in this field. So I can't remember what year it was, but in Wired magazine, there was a great article, like interview with him. And then he's also been on Peter Attia's podcast. So excellent to hear his understanding of this. But he was, oncologist, oncology researcher, using maximum tolerated dose, which is what we do. It's like, well, how do you kill, like the highest amount a patient can tolerate before they die, and then hope they come back from that. That is literally, it's a thing. It's called MTD, maximum tolerated dose. That is what we base our research on. That's then what we apply once you get through clinical trials, phase 3. Then you say, this is the maximum tolerated dose, and that's what we put everybody on. At that point, we then talk about homogenize. We're like, we're going to give everybody this and expect that everyone will have the same response, again, to a heterogenic process. What this doctor was picked up on was he saw in this field of moths that were like just devastating this crop, is that basically the harder you sprayed them, the more robust they would come back. And the harder they would be to kill over and over. Fascinating. So he learned that from the farmers, which they realized if you basically go over to a corner of your crop and you put a little bit of the poison on it, it sends off this, what we would call in medicine, an abscopal effect.
Oh, yeah.
That basically sends signaling out to the rest of the crop that allows it to defend itself. And instead of going after the moths, they basically are like, we'll do a little bit so that the rest of the crop can respond accordingly. So he and others in other universities around the United States have moved into this idea of adaptive theory of cancer, which is, to your point, you take a little bit, a metronomic dose, and you put that into the system and you push it back just enough, like just to kind of bring a little information to the system that sends out all these other signals that say, body, do your job.
Yeah.
And Dr. Mark Rosenberg, he has spoken to this so much more eloquently than me, so please go listen to him. But he talked, it's like, this is the place where he explained it in one of Paul Anderson's conferences many years ago, that he's like, you've got the daughter cells, which are the rapid turnover proliferating cancer cells. Then they're the ones that are out there that are, you have a proliferating score, a Ki-67 score. When that's elevated, those are patients that respond better to those cytotoxic therapies, chemo, radiation, surgery, targeted therapies.
You can recognize the context of the individual.
Exactly. And so it's like, so that you go, okay, let's say that you have those rapid cells. When you do maximum tolerated dose, you do everything you can to wipe out every one of those cells.
Yeah.
That's then what makes the more aggressive moths that we just talked about. Right. But what happens is if you just come in and you put a little bit into the equation, you might pull back, let's say 50% of those cancer cells. You like kind of build a little bit of a runway, and then you back off and you let the body do its thing. And you only intervene with another little sort of sprinkling of the poison just when it gets to a certain volume, certain level. And then you do the same thing, and it buys you more time, and you're then start to switch this into a battle zone, into a maintained zone. Like, here's now something that people can live long, healthy lives with cancer and not die of it. And here, coming all the way back, when you over-harvest those daughter cells, when you over-treat, overkill with maximum tolerated dose, you inherently wake up what they call the mother cells, which are the stem cells. And she's pissed.
As I say, if you piss off mama, guess what? Everybody's going to suffer.
And this is what happens. So when you see in standard of care, they do, okay, line 1 of treatment. Great response. You went into remission. Everything's good. And everyone's like, ring the bell. We're on with life. Go back to the life you were before.
Yeah.
Please don't.
Yeah.
But then the next time, oh, it's back. Okay, we're going to do the same thing because it worked last time. We're going to do it again. Guess what? It doesn't work as well. Maybe you get 3 months of progression-free survival, but it's less. And then it comes back again. You do the same thing again, and you only get a couple weeks or maybe no response at all. So what happens is you get less and less sensitized to the treatment as you go on because you've created those more aggressive mutations. You created more aggressive mother stem cells coming up. This is what we do differently in our world.
That's right. That's right.
100%. And this is where oncology is going. And it's not some made up BS. It's things we've observed from nature, from the agricultural world. It's things we've just intuitively feel. But it's also like push it back just enough to let the body do her job, do its job beautifully.
Yeah, I always say that the best answer to cancer is never get it. Beyond
Right.
that, the best
That's the
answer to
starting
cancer
point. Yeah.
is the immune system. Let the immune system do what it's designed to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't destroy it and think now we'll get cancer.
Yeah. Now we're going to do it. Well, what about like here's so again, just a few years ago, everyone said that immune system had nothing to do with cancer, and yet now that we can monetize it, it's the soup of the day,
Oh,
right? And
there's
so
a hot topic.
I know
right
that one. But here's what's so interesting: the time we are now applying. So if I may, this is a really interesting piece here that even at best, immune therapies still work about 20% of the time. And when I say work, that's response, not cure.
That's a very good point, because the implication is the benefit equals cure.
Right.
And that's not the case at all.
And so patients then read a headline, their doctor sort of maybe misrepresents the reality of it. So everyone's like, oh, this is going to be my answer. So when these drugs came out on the market, everyone was like applying it to, very specific, to melanoma, to certain kidney cancer. Like it started in small areas, but it was a last resort. They were giving these immune therapies after multiple lines of treatments failed the patients. I want to really be specific about why I chose that languaging, is because standard of care says that the patients failed the treatment. But it's the other way around. The treatment failed the patient. And so when the treatment fails the patient, when they wait, what's happening is we've learned you waited too long. There is no immune system to even stimulate with a checkpoint inhibitor. So we've brought it on board way too late. The idea, brilliant, but you brought it on to the game too late. So here's a really good example. A year or so ago, the man who wrote the foreword to our mistletoe book, Dr. Luis Diaz, who was also the man who stepped up courageously to take on the role of doing a mistletoe trial at Hopkins while he was still at Hopkins. He then moved over to Sloan Kettering, and he is the head of solid tumor. He made international news not too far ago when he had 18 patients went into 100% remission with the checkpoint inhibitor. And everyone's like, it's the checkpoint. Everyone's pointing at the checkpoint inhibitors or what did it. But when you look at the study, and when I know him the way I know him, and when I ask the questions, the thing they didn't tell about were tell me about the patients. So the patients, there's an actual, out of MD Anderson, they created a prognostic score that said patients with more than a handful of these prognostic factors are becoming less or more a candidate for these drugs. So things like if you're over the age of 52, you're going to have a poorer response. If you have a poor ECOG score, so a daily function score of more than 0, you're going to have a poor response. If you have elevated LDH, we talked about that the other day, poor response. If you've got anything going on with your liver, poor response. If you've got high neutrophils, poor response. If you have low lymphocytes, poor response. If you have high platelets, poor response. 7. Well, guess what? Most of our patients have at least 3, if not more, especially when they've been overtreated. So that being separate, that was separate. Dr. Diaz likely didn't know about that when he had this group of patients, but this group of patients were all under the age of 50, and they all had Lynch syndrome.
Interesting.
And they are all not treated. They had not gone through standard of care. So they were treatment naive with a particular epigenetic pattern, methylation DNA repair, which is also because Lynch, by the way, is all about how difficult it is to repair your DNA.
Right.
So these patients had not already further kicked the poop out of it with the standard of care. So they were treatment naive. So they still had something to work with. That also means they had an immune system to work with. And they likely didn't have all those 7 prognostic factors. Wow. And so suddenly this drug, when it's used in the right place at the right time, at the right dose, duration, in the right medium, the right soil, it's a freaking miracle.
But what we're even talking about there is heterogeneity.
Yeah.
We're talking about understanding the proper context of the individual through testing, through physical exam, etc., and being able to provide the right treatment for the right patient at the right time. It's
Dose duration combination.
individualized therapy.
Absolutely.
That's what it is. And so one of the things we have to work really hard, I believe, Nasha, is that we have to recognize what we tend to do in medicine, which is hold fast to that one-hit hypothesis,
Yeah,
magic
yeah.
bullet theory. There was a little bit of a debate that occurred talking about metabolic flexibility, and so I wanted to highlight
Yeah, it's a big one.
A quote here that was the differentiation between mitochondrial. No, actually, that wasn't it. Yeah, that there was a statement made that dysbiosis, so imbalanced gut bacteria, contributes to mitochondrial dysfunction, subsequently elevating glycolysis. So it was really just saying, hey, we're going to reimagine the one-hit hypothesis, but do it from a kind of natural alternative perspective.
Green allopathy.
That
Yeah.
beautiful. Did you just make that up?
No, it's a coin term out there. It's been out
Okay.
there for a long time.
Haven't heard that one. So, but then there was somebody that said, no, what we're really dealing with is cancer cells reprogramming and adapting mitochondrial function.
Yeah.
And there's actually research that shows that in cancer cells, there are functioning mitochondria.
Yeah.
So this
exactly.
this concept, so this debate broke out a little bit about this inflexibility, but from a natural alternative perspective versus no, what we're really dealing with is flexibility, heterogeneity.
Yeah.
And so hats off to Ahmed.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce his name?
Dr. Ahmed El-Saka.
Yeah, Asaka. Now he's in Egypt, but he really, I think, so eloquently talked about the adaptability, the flexibility, the plasticity, the reprogramming that cancer is really doing.
Yeah.
Versus the debate that it's one process.
Yeah.
And I think it ties into this concept of cancer as a heterogeneous disease.
And an opportunistic one.
Oh.
And so if you take away its opportunistic nature, if you make the environment inhospitable to it doing its thing, it can live with you and in you indefinitely and not cause problems. And that's what is so different, is that people will keep looking at an image or at a tumor account and be like, it's still there, we've got to completely eradicate. Well, maybe those are just showing us that it's still there. But when you look at everything that's wrapped around it, how is that communication going? How is that support happening?
There's a process called immunoediting.
Yeah.
Probably aware of that, where you can have elimination, equilibrium, and escape. It's whereby you have the tumor and you have the immune system.
Yeah.
And clearly one of the key aspects of how cancer spreads is immune escape.
Yeah, that's huge.
And that's where the full dose chemo can really contribute to the metastatic process. But if you can achieve equilibrium, where the immune system is keeping the cancer in check, and you're there for 3, 4, 5 decades, that's a success story.
Beyond. But that's
anecdotal,
but
that's kind of
Nathan.
your story too.
Exactly.
And so what happened is you moved.
Apparently I'm just an anecdote, and thousands of my patients are just an anecdote, and no one seems to care about an anecdote, by the way.
I encourage you to check out the podcast that just dropped with Paul Merrick and Pierre Corey, because Pierre Corey just said it's an anecdote, but it's nonetheless reality.
Exactly.
When are we going to just quit throwing anecdotes aside and go, wow, look at that.
What about that? Do we need to explore further? Yeah.
You're the antidote that was diagnosed with at age 19. And like I told the other day, you're 29, actually.
Yeah.
She dated herself talking about microfish in the library. I did not do that.
There.
It's like, that's you. That's on you. That's on you. But so then what you did is you helped achieve equilibrium.
Yeah.
Where your immune system was in balance with the cancer. Great place to be. But then what you could do, and what you did, is you basically started to slowly tilt the imbalance,
Yeah.
the immune system, and now you
Into my
started to
favor.
lead to
Yeah.
elimination,
Yeah.
which is, you just told me your CA 125 marker was,
The normal for the first time in 32 years.
and what number was it?
18.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it like before that it was
How high was it when you were first?
when I was first diagnosed, it was over 15,000. It took about 6 years to get it under 10,000. It took another 10 years until 2009 to get it into the hundreds. And that we talked about that. That was on dealing with some dental stuff. And then it's just been a slow adjustment. And then a little TMI, but I want people to understand this. When I finally moved through menopause, which always freaks people out because you're like, wait a minute, ovarian cancer, shouldn't she not? Because people assume that I won't have my bits and whatnot. And so, no, I just moved through that. And that was another, like my body said, just hang on. We've got a life raft coming for you. You're almost there. Because that turned off another area that was contributing to my terrain. It's like, especially those last few bumpy years of making the transition in perimenopause, between stress and, diet, lifestyle, traveling so much, exposures to mold, all the things bumping into the perimenopause, it was really hard to keep maneuvering around and trying to maintain that homeostasis. And so I just took one other complicating factor out of the equation in this last year to move across the threshold of menopause, which has given me a leg up that I feel like this year is about reestablishing homeostasis in a new field because I don't have that same signaling. But it was amazing to see that I went from almost 100 on my CA125 to 18 just by crossing over the menopause threshold. I was
So
very intrigued by
you're
that.
presenting a different concept, and this is also heterogeneous as well, that the way we approach cancer conventionally is go to war. It is, try to achieve no evidence of disease as fast as we can, unleash hell, all side effects be damned, forgive the language. But you've taken a very different approach, and it's one I think we need to take note of because you have many patients that have followed the same approach.
Absolutely.
You've lived as you've healed.
Yeah.
You have over just at least a few decades.
Yeah.
You have slowly engaged in this plasticity, this
Right.
metabolic flexibility, understanding that you can have time
Yeah.
and adapt in the cancer treatment and then build momentum with a snowball that rolls downhill so that now here a few decades later, you're healing, you're on your way to healed, and yet you are not just living,
Right. Right.
you are changing the trajectory of a practice of medicine through history.
Right.
That is a perfect example
Yeah.
of heterogeneous.
Yeah.
But it's not in the confines within cancer. It's evident
Everything.
in the antidote
Yeah.
of your life that is
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
So you don't have to rush to
Yeah.
the treatment. It's like buyer's remorse, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yep. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you just said something. So I think about now, in full transparency, the last couple of years have been very stressful for all of us, really. I mean, really, the last few years, everything's
Yeah.
changed. But just big picture, this has probably been one of the biggest cauldrons of stress I've been in, like continuously over a couple year period of time. So there are things I need to do to adjust and support my terrain further, which is I'm doing it and I'm doing the best I can, like all of us. But I will say, big picture, I was definitely healthier in my 30s than I was in my teens and 20s. By the time I reached my 40s, I was way healthier than I was in my teens, 20s, 30s. Now into my 50s, despite these last kind of bumpy years, I'm looking at my life and my peers, my colleagues, my friends, my family members that are in the same age range as I am. I spent so many decades working on my terrain that I don't see and get the same types of things. I'm on no medications. Well, I do take some low dose naltrexone, but that's a whole nother thing there. But that's it. I'm watching all the friends of my age range falling apart, like just falling apart and on multiple medications and multiple diagnoses. And
their warranty ran out.
Their warranties run out. Their little mitochondria is like enough already.
Yeah.
So in some ways, I was so lucky to get an early start on this process that starts in your youth. You have to start this journey because, to your point, the only cure for cancer is prevention.
That's right.
And then once it takes root, the necessity, the requirement to do all the things to create that homeostasis that you talked about is what's required. If you are, I'm sorry, I'm going to be a little harsher. If you are delusional enough to think that a standard of care therapy alone is going to be enough, that an alternative approach is going to be enough, that just a quick one change in your diet is going to be enough, or just praying it away or meditating it away or yogaing it away or juicing it away is going to be enough, you're delusional. And I don't mean that rudely. I need you to wake up and realize everything. And we were talking this morning about the hardest part of my practice is when I see people who know what their obstacle to cure is.
Oh yeah, we're talking about it from a different concept, relationships.
Exactly, which is huge.
Yeah.
And so when the people closest to you are not in resonance with who you are, help you be a better, healthier version of yourself, and you do the same for them in a reciprocal, loving, safe environment, trusting environment, your cells are getting that message too.
Yeah.
And so we were talking about there's so many folks I've had that would stay in the field of that toxicity and then wonder why their cancer isn't going away. It's like, they're like, I do all the things. I do the diet. I did my metronomic chemo. I did the supplements. I did X, Y, and Z. And why is it not getting better? Well, that's exactly when we've done all the things. That's when we look at the mind body. That's when we look at the spiritual. That's when we look at the relational. That's when we look at that piece. That's the hardest piece and often the most important. And I wish everyone started there, but we're humans. We want to do the tangible first. And so that piece plays a role in this as well. And that's definitely an area that standard of care doesn't talk about.
So one thing doesn't cause cancer, nor can one thing treat
Yeah.
cancer. And cancer is a heterogeneous process. Cancer in one person is a heterogeneous process. They look at the
cancer in one tumor.
That's right.
Is
They
a
look at,
heterogeneous-
everybody looks at the tumor and tumor microenvironment and they think the whole area is hypoxic. No,
Yeah.
it's hypoxic and there's normoxic areas. We are understanding the flexibility, the adaptability, the heterogeneity of this, but we've actually, we didn't dive into like the reverse Otto Warburg or Crabtree effect. We didn't get into all these other areas and we probably would have lost you there. But I think you eloquently have helped us to describe the entire heterogeneity process that is cancer. And it has to also bring to the forefront the heterogeneous aspect of the thinking of cancer. We must continue work to innovate, to elevate. And I love what you're doing with the Metabolic Terrain Health Institute, because we must put the information out there for debate and discourse.
Absolutely.
We must challenge what we think. We must challenge what each other thinks, because out of that, that's where you get innovation and elevation of thought. And that is a perfect example of the heterogeneity that we need in this process. So where is the Metabolic Terrain Health Institute going in the future? Because it's as an institution, it's fairly young, correct?
Yeah.
How?
Well, in one way, I started dreaming about this early on in my diagnosis of a place. I started having, I guess, visions about a place where people could go and have everything under one roof. A deep dive assessment of what brought that person to their knees, what brought that person to meet a diagnosis of cancer. Now our patients have to piecemeal all of it together. You know, if you just want to do standard care and stay in your own little environment, you can do that, but it's not going to be enough for most people.
Right.
Over 70% will have a recurrence. And so being aware of that is very important to know. I have to do more than just this one thing. So, but to do that, now you've got to go all over the place.
Right.
So having one place. The other thing is I'm so data driven that I want all the information. So we're building a data platform to collect the data. When people say there is no data, there is. It's just not collected in a meaningful way and translated in a meaningful way, and that's what we're building. We are building a lab from everything from R&D, like development of novel delivery systems and novel products, that are less toxic, but are just, coming from off-label drugs or things, or metronomic things that can be repurposed in a way that we can harness their power with the less toxicity to the healthy cells and more toxicity to the cancer cells. We are building that. We're building a cell line study lab. We're building a what's known as seahorse mitochondrial respiration lab, and a PCR, so the genomics, the polyomics we talked about lab, to look at all of that. That's happening in Phoenix. We have what we call our virtual campuses, which is the education platform of, at this point, well over 200 clinicians in 36 countries, 300 advocates in 36 countries. We have a new cohort starting in February for the docs. We do it twice a year. We have a cohort starting in April for the advocates. That's also offered twice a year. We're building this mycelium net. So we're creating this cohesive language narrative to help people get a methodology that's similar, because we want the autonomy. We want people to still do their thing, but there's a method you can use that is global and very effective to show you, are we doing what we think we're doing? Is the patient responding the way we think they're responding? So we're building the education, we're building the data platform, we're building the research institute. We've got the clinicians offering these care all over, but eventually we'll have the campus, which is in Southeast Arizona on a 1,200-acre organic regenerative farm with a 250,000 square foot, 150-bed residential, hospital and research institute that we hope is a training ground for clinicians from all over the world, plus them coming in. Our training is so much like a mastermind of bringing the best of the best brains in all aspects of this, from MDs, NDs, PAs, DOs, psychiatrists, biological dentists, even veterinary medicine has come through our training program and beyond, that we know we are creating a ripple out there. And it is all about the focus on the individual and what their input is to their terrain, and how it's being interpreted and expressed in their body, which guides us to know exactly what dose, duration, combination, is warranted for that person in that time. And so we are not going and fixing the system because it's not interested in repairing. It just isn't.
No.
So we're going to build a new one. You and hundreds of others are already well into that mission. And we know that in the next couple of years, there'll be thousands, and then it will become that 100th monkey that becomes millions. And this, what we're talking about, already is standard of care.
That's right. That's the future. That's hope. And what you're displaying there and what you're discussing is, again, that concept of heterogeneity, but it's not becoming stagnant unthought. It's your history and your repetitive nature of not being satisfied, but continuing to learn and to act, but then also working with others. It's, as Steve mentioned when we first came in, Stephen was talking about community. That's what you're building, is community. There's heterogeneity within the community. And within that, we can bring together new innovation, new elevations, and advanced therapy. So, you presented a future. And as I tell you, hope is confidence in a tomorrow, in a future. This is why you are the great Nasha winners, because you do great things. You act. You don't satisfy with what you've done. And those points of action are much more than just new ideas. You're building. And if you're a doctor, or if you're as a patient, or if you're as a practitioner, a nutritionist, a veterinarian, a pharmacist, this is a collection of individuals, different individuals from around the world, different backgrounds, different thinking, heterogeneity. But with that, we're going to bring new ideas. And Nasha is leading the way there, I believe, in a way that is helping to set that new system. So, Dr. Nasha Winners, thank you for being such a gracious host and opening up your life, your weekend to us, your beautiful beach, and your wonderful husband. As you said I would love Stephen, and I do.
I know.
He's awesome. He's awesome. We've had several geek conversations about biochemistries and stuff. It's lots of fun, a lot of it around medical cannabis and stuff like that. But I hope what you garner from this, and this weekend with the great Nasha Winners, is that there's a tomorrow, there's a future, and there's a hope in it. And that's what hope is. So thank you for joining this podcast series. I encourage you to like it, give us a 5-star review, share this with everybody that you would think would benefit this. It could be that there are people that have their fur babies that have cancer. Share it, because this same concept applies there. You may be an individual affected by cancer. Your family may be affected by cancer. There is no family in the world that's not impacted by cancer. So thank you for being here. Share this, like it, follow us on social media. Wherever you go on social media to socialize, we're there, such as Dr.Goodyear Instagram. You'll find us everywhere, but also drgoodyear.com. That's our personal brand website where you will find the podcast, but you can download the podcast anywhere as they're doing construction. But then that's our that's our cue. That's our cue. No, that's our cue. But then also you can find me at brio-medical.com. And Dr. Nasha Winters, where can they find you?
Please come look for me at either drnasha.com, drnasha.com, or mtih.org, which stands for Metabolic Terrain Institute of Health.org. They also cross-pollinate with one another, but it shows all the things that we're doing. It shows all the podcasts and interviews and things that we're on. Just launched our own podcast.
Which you have your own pod.
Yeah.
So is that on one of those websites?
It's its own little zone, but you'll see the links on both those sites. But it's called Metabolic Matters.
Okay. Ooh, I like that.
.org.
I like that. And I've seen the emails.
Yeah. And so one of these days he'll be my guest, I hope. So, but it's really, this is just it. It's like these are, and that's a play on words, because metabolic does matter. Yeah. And it's about the matters of metabolic and all the different things. So it's really great because it expands on all the things you and I have gotten to share with each other and everybody else today. But thank you for the opportunity to be with you. Thank you for your wisdom and your desire to amplify this important message into the world. And thank you for being part of this movement. Because I look at, we're all linking arms. There is no competition.
Absolutely no.
It is like, how do we do better together?
I look at it as we're a team.
Yeah, 100%.
And it's only when we work together, as we said yesterday, we're not short on patience at all.
I wish we were.
Yeah, but it's only by working together, putting aside pride, putting aside ego, and working together. That is the only way we innovate. That's the only way we elevate, and that's the only way we empower you as patients, you as physicians, to guess what? Provide hope, heal, teach, serve, speak on truth, build trust with patients, and build a legacy that is healing, both with the patient at the cellular level, but also with doctors, to build that new system that builds a legacy that changes how we approach cancer. One that doesn't go to war, but one that heals. That's hope. And remember, hope it forward. Dr. Goodyear of the Practicing with Dr. Nathan Goodyear podcast, thank you for joining us in the beautiful south of the border, Mexico.